Hi everyone, and thank you for joining our Renewables and Agriculture webinar today, Renewing the Regions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the country that we meet on, or I meet on, Wiradjuri land, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and extend that to all Aboriginal people here today. We've had a really fantastic response to this webinar. We've had about 400 registrations, which is really encouraging to see the level of interest in this space growing. This webinar is very much about sharing the stories of what farmers are doing with renewables to cut costs and emissions. Just a few housekeeping. If you've got any questions, leave them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll endeavour to get to them after each speaker. We've also made time at the end of the webinar, and a couple of experts will be joining us to do a bit of a panel discussion around some of the questions. I want to thank my conference committee. I'll just change for their support in bringing this event together today, and also for Farmers for Climate Action, in particular Fiona, Claire and Charlie for partnering with me and helping with the background logistics of today's event. I'd also like to thank Regen Energy for their kind sponsorship. They've got a really beautiful website, so if you're after an ethical solar installer and supplier, please check them out. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Karen Stark. I live on a farm in the central west of New South Wales, and I founded the National Renewables and Agriculture Conference. I own my own business, farm consulting, farm renewables consulting, which is all around building capacity, facilitation and communication in the energy and ag space. For me, renewables is the way of the future. The transformative effects that behind the meter on farm renewables is having on many Australian farms is having a massive impact. And that includes our farm, which is what you can see in front of you now. We installed a 500 kilowatt solar diesel irrigation pump in 2018, and this is having significant benefits for our farm business, reducing our diesel costs by about 180,000.
Okay. So you might want to work out with the mute. And
what's that, sorry? Anyway, saving $180,000 on diesel every year, as well as saving 500 tonnes of CO2 from entering the atmosphere. So we're really proud of that. And we really want other farmers to benefit from this renewable energy transition, which led me to convening the national conference happening next year. So this conference is proud to showcase some of the innovative farmers with you this morning. The webinar is a bit of a prelude to the national conference happening on the 19th of May 2021 in Dubbo. Please do come along because last year demonstrated the huge value that participants receive from chatting face to face to others working in the space, and also hearing from farmers who are doing great things with renewables on their farms. Based on the feedback from last year as well, we'll be having a breakout session just on bioenergy. So if you're really interested in that, please do come along. There'll be a lot of information there. An important element of the conference is also the expo, which brings together credible, trustworthy renewable energy suppliers and consultants for farmers to speak to over the course of the day about options on their farm. This part of the event last year was hugely successful, and we're actually inviting credible suppliers right now to be part of the expo in 2021. So if you know of a really good business, please get in touch with me, or if you're a great, trustworthy business yourself, please also get in touch. So I'm really thrilled about the speakers that we've lined up today, and massive thank you to all of them for generously sharing their time and knowledge with us, given it's a really busy time of the year. We'll have a couple of experts at the end joining us to help with any questions that might come up. And thanks also to everyone who sent in some questions as part of the registration. We won't be able to get to them all. I've sent a few of them to the speakers to try and include as part of their presentations. I'd like to now introduce Charlie Prell, who I have deep respect for. He's part of my conference committee as a farmer, and he's the chair of Farmers for Climate Action. So Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Karen. I'm the newly elected chair of Farmers for Climate Action, which is a group in Australia of farmers and agricultural suppliers who are dedicated to solving the climate crisis within Australia. And that includes moving the debate from where it has been, it's actually moving quite quickly now, into what we do about climate change rather than whether climate change is real or not. It's an absolute pleasure to support you and this renewables and ag agenda. From a farmer's perspective, we're in Australia, we're at the front line of climate change, and we're already feeling significant impacts from climate change. So we need to do something about addressing climate change. That's the bad news, but the good news is if we do address the issue of climate change, and in Australia, that means predominantly changing our electricity system from fossil fuel powered energy to renewable energy. The good news of that is that all of that activity will happen in regional Australia, and most of it will happen on farms. So farmers can be not only addressing the threat of climate change, but can be beneficiaries, huge beneficiaries of the shift and the transition of the energy system, particularly the electricity system from fossil fuels to energy, to renewables. That has to be done in the right way, and it has to be done with full partnership agreements with the communities where those farmers live, because a lot of those communities are very small, not so worldly communities, and they need to be treated as partners, not as lessors and lessees. But Farmers for Climate Action are dedicated to that. There's other entities that are working in that space as well. I just want to draw your attention to two reports that we've produced in the last 12 months. During the COVID crisis, there was a call from the government in about Easter time this year for responses to the COVID crisis, to the pandemic. Farmers for Climate Action produced a report called Regional Horizons, which is the only report that I know of that's focused on regional Australia. I encourage you really strongly to have a look at that report. Some of the initiatives that we identified in that report are already being enacted under different names by governments at different levels. And just recently, we've produced a report called Foot Off the Gas, which challenges the Australian government, the Australian federal government's direction to produce a gas-fired recovery. There is no benefit to anybody from a gas-fired recovery except for the gas companies. And there's lots of threats to regional Australians, particularly in relation to water, and we need to identify that. So we've produced a report that we've released. All of this stuff, I'm not sharing my screen because I'd much rather you look at me than the screen. All of this stuff is available on our website, which is farmersforclimateaction.org.au. That's one word. And we've moved from a group of about 30 farmers 5 years ago to now being one of the significant voices in the climate space in Australia, with over 5,000 farmers as members and supporters, and probably something like 25,000 followers on social media. We think we're having a dramatic impact, and we think that's because of the way we're engaging in this debate. We're not being antagonistic about this. We're offering solutions, and we're actually identifying the positive initiatives that can be done and taken in regional Australia by governments at all stripes. The New South Wales government's recent announcement that they're going to produce 32 gigawatts, I think it is, of renewable energy over the next 10 years is just a great example of how regional Australia can benefit if there's strong government leadership. Our ambition in Farmers for Climate Action, just to finish, is not net zero by 2050. We don't think that's nearly ambitious enough to meet the Paris Agreement. It should be net zero emissions, absolutely, and it needs to be by 2030 to 2035. That's our statement, but we're at the moment supporting the National Farmers Federation and their ambition of net zero emissions by 2050, because that's a starting point. And we want to dial up that ambition, as is outlined in the Paris Agreement, to something that's going to address the climate crisis in Australia. So thanks, Karen. Good luck with this conference. It's great to see so many people attending, and congratulations to you for being the driver behind this initiative. It's great. So thank you. I hope it goes well.
Thank you, Charlie, for that. And I really encourage everyone to check out the Farmers for Climate Action website as well. Thanks, Charlie. So our next speaker I came across in the virtual Agrivoltaics conference in France a couple of months ago. which is all about combining energy generation and food and fibre production, which I'm really passionate about. And it just makes sense because it provides multiple benefits for the environment and agriculture. And I'd love to see more happening in this space. It also elevates the debate in Australia around the use of prime agricultural land for large-scale solar farms, because you can graze sheep and grow crops under panels. I learned at the conference, for example, that in Japan, they grow about 120 different crops under solar panels, which is pretty impressive, and they've been doing it for a long time. So Chad Higgins I didn't actually get a bio for you, but you're an associate professor at the Department of Biological and Ecological Engineering at Oregon State University, and he's got rescue roosters on his farm. Over to you, Chad.
Thanks. Yeah, so let me share my screen here quickly. And I'll show you first where in the world I am. So I'm in Oregon here, and if I just zoom in, and and a little farther, a little farther, a little farther, a little farther, a little farther. I'm sitting on my farm, which is right here, the hazelnut farm in the US and the Willamette Valley of Oregon. So it's nice and green, but we still have to irrigate. So switching over to my talk. Thanks, Karen. I've been looking at this question of how do you fully integrate ag production and solar energy harvesting for a number of years now. And we've been doing trials and trying to show exactly what you can expect if you go down this route. And we've really tried a variety of systems. I'm not going to go deep into any of them today, but if you want to, I'm free to ask questions. And I'm just going to give you the high level of each one of those. So this is the sketch of the benefits, and this is the hypothesis that we start with, is that if you actually measure the sunlight that comes down, most crops, save things like sugarcane and corn, really don't need as much sunlight as they get. Somewhere around 60 to 40% of the sun that arrives on those plant leaves is not used to produce more plant or crop itself. It's just used to pump water so that the plants themselves can stay cool in a warmer environment. So the idea behind all of this is that you design a solar array such that you just remove the excess solar and no more. That shade reduces the water demand on the plants below, leaving more water available in the aquifer or whatever water source you're using for your irrigation. The less stressed plants tend to produce more and better crops. And as a bonus effect, because you're taking something that was probably quite barren and maybe irrigating it and growing some crops, that creates a cooler microclimate for the panels, which the panel's efficiency depends on the panel temperature. So if you're in a colder, if you just give it a little cooler temperature around it, it will actually produce more energy than it would have if you had bare land underneath it. So in theory, and this is the theory, I haven't proved it to you yet, this is a four-way win. More food, more energy, better food, less water. It sounds too good to be true. Let's get into it. So the water story. Here's just some measurements of the water that we did. I did a study, and this study is, let's see, it's dryland pasture for sheep grazing, and we just measured the soil moisture underneath the solar panels, in between the solar panels, adjacent to the solar panels, basically everywhere. And if you look through, this is days from the start of the growing season. So my growing season starts in around April and then goes to around September. We started with saturated soils because in Oregon it rains a lot over the winter. That grass crop came up, some annuals, some perennials, and started to draw down that water. In the fully open area and in the fully sunny areas, that's these two lines, the water drawdown happened fast enough that the plants stopped being productive around day 60 in the season. However, underneath the panels, the plants were water efficient enough to leave water in the soil column the entire season and continued to grow through the entire season. The fact that, and again, this is a non-irrigated system, so they're, this is a live example of how much water is actually saved. Since they grew double the amount of time, we actually had double the amount of total pasture production throughout their growing season. So we saved water and we grew more forage, which was pretty cool. So that means that on average, our water use efficiency, the crop per drop, increased by a factor of 4. It increased 400%, which was pretty amazing, actually, and something I was really proud of. We also did studies on macroecology and on animal welfare and behavior. So here's a picture of our site where we did pollinator studies. And when I say we, I mean my graduate student, Maggie Graham. She spent a summer camped out in the solar field here, basically collecting insect samples and identifying those samples to the species. Collecting flower blooms, identifying those to the species, and figuring out how many blooms, how many pollinators, and what those pollinators were everywhere around these solar panels. Essentially, the take-home message was there is more blooms and more bees in the area here between the panels than anywhere else. The second highest was outside the array. And then the last place was right in the area where it's full shade all the time, which kind of makes sense. So, but to me, the most interesting thing that we saw, well, first, is that the bees, they didn't discriminate between the flowers. So I had some people ask about, oh, does the electric fields generated by these solar panels affect insect behavior? We didn't find any evidence of that. The bees ate the pollen just the same, no matter where it was. But because of the shading, and this being a dryland system as well, the timing of bloom shifted. And the more shade there was, the farther later into the season the bloom timing was. And that's important for us here because our late season, sort of right at the end of the growing season, there's very few forage opportunities for our native pollinators. And that's just when they're preparing to overwinter. So, getting a bloom to happen in our August or September actually really increases the likelihood that the bees will survive the winter because it provides them forage at that critical time. So I think that is more significant than just the sheer number of bees, is the fact that we can pick species and shade fractions to change the timing of bloom such that the bees are most benefited. I don't know exactly what species those are yet. Research is ongoing. These are our sheep. The study with the data that I showed you was on this grass here behind our sheep, wean lambs that we grew. And we actually made 6 plots, each 1/10 of a hectare, and stocked 5 to 6 sheep in each one. I hired an army of undergrads to monitor those sheep, and we took notes on their behavior, wool samples, did live weight gains, just to see and monitor things like water consumption, just to see how those sheep behaved. If they have a chance to be under the solar panels, they go under the solar panels. I think it's a natural behavior for them to seek shelter, but it actually became a problem because they trampled the area under the solar panels so much that the grass stopped growing there. They also lodge a lot under the solar panels, which is, well, it's nice to see them smiling here anyways. So in terms of a behavioral study, they definitely preferred the under panel situation. They definitely preferentially ate the forage that is in the partially shaded area, they consumed a lot less water, almost half the amount of water when they had that much shade available for us. So you know, their watering needs were substantially less. And there was no change in live weight gains. So whether they were in open pasture or in the, you know, in the pasture underneath the solar panels, they grew at the same rate. So, you know, this is an example of, before we were doing this, my university paid $10,000 a year to mow this pasture. And now they don't pay anything. And it was because the fire marshal would come by and cite them, or give them a warning, not cite them, and say, hey, it's too dry, there's a fire risk, you got to knock these this forage down. But when we graze it the correct way, that doesn't happen. The sheep keep it nice and in shape, which is pretty nice. And it was a win for all of us. And I want to thank Mary Smallman. Yes, our shepherdess is Mary. She does all the sheep and keeps them in the off season and does all the lambing, and she does an excellent job on all of that. And I couldn't have done this with them without her, or Sirkin Ates, who is my my collaborator in the animal side of things. Just for fun, because I'm an engineer, I have to put one engineering plot in here. You know, there was some talk about the importance of ag lands as a solution to the global climate crisis. So one of the things that I did is, my students and I did, is that we actually cataloged the potential for solar energy production based on land cover for the entire globe. And when you rank them by potential, ag lands come first. And then grasslands, which is basically pastures, comes second. There's a whole bunch of reasons for this. One is, you know, farming is just solar harvesting by another name. You know, electricity versus calories, it's all energy from a thermodynamic perspective. But farming had 8,000 years head start on solar, so they found all the good spots already, you know. But this is one of the reasons why I think there is some pressure for what is perceived now as a competition between solar and ag, but is not in any way, because we can do both together collectively. The other thing that came out of this study is, because of the total of power available here, right around 27 watts per meter squared, and an average ag land on Earth, you know, we could actually get rid of fossil fuels with 1% of ag land done this way. It's a very small amount of it. Well, putting it in the US, sorry, I didn't run Aussie's numbers, but they're probably similar. You know, compared to the global average, the US is a larger consumer per capita of energy. So the equivalent 1% of our US cropland, though, would reach our nation's sustainable energy targets as we move forward, meaning that they would still have a mix of fossil fuels, but 50% of our energy thereabouts coming from renewables. And then of the 100% of the total energy portfolio, 20% of that coming from solar is what this would be. And given by what our 2019 budget is, not 2020. I did it on the 2019 budget in the US because 2020 is kind of a special circumstance in terms of fiscal stimulus. To do that would only cost 1% of the annual budget of the United States. And that would reach our energy targets. And that's with the government picking up the bill for everything. And I anticipate that this type of approach will also have free market forces behind it, because it makes our growers quite a bit of money. The researcher in me also loves to repurpose extra energy. So, you know, there's an old adage in the US that farming can overproduce anything. And energy is no exception. So if 2% of the farms in the US went ahead and did this, then we'd have a real big energy surplus on our hands. So, you know, there's all kinds of fun ways to repurpose excess energy to make agriculture more sustainable. Electric tractors are coming out. This is the one I'm getting, actually. The Solic Track. It's a little startup here in California. This is just a little baby tractor. They don't have any large devices yet. What is this? 35 horse tractor, but it's 100% solar, operates for 10 hours with the implements going, and recharges overnight or, during the day if you have solar panels. So you could take diesel fuel out of farming if you wanted to right now, today. You can buy this today, and it's comparable in price. It's not a lot more expensive. It's only like $1,000 more expensive than than an equivalent John Deere or what do you use, Mahindra over there mostly? I don't know. So anyways, we have that. The next thing we can do is we can actually make fertilizer from electricity. And the ingredients are water, electricity, and air. That's all you need to make sustainable fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. And this is actually well known. Here's an article about the process. I'm not an expert in this, but there is now a company that just started this year in the United States to use excess energy from solar to make things like fertilizer, and that's one of their products. So I'm trying to forge a partnership with them for the later stages of our work. But their solution, they've already built this. It sits at your irrigation pump. It pulls out the water it needs to make the fertilizer, makes it, re-injects it back into your irrigation line. You don't buy the fertilizer. It just does it because you have this sun on site, enough electricity. And of course, if you have irrigation, you've got water, and I'm sure you've got air. So you have all the ingredients, which I think is pretty cool. In terms of the growers here in the US, typically how this works is that the power company leases the rights to put a solar array on that land. Those lease rates are round about 2,000 US per hectare. And often they'll give an energy reduction cost to the grower. I think Karen is doing behind the meters stuff. We can also do that, but we can do net metering here as well as if you can afford it and put enough solar, and you can sell the electricity through the market if you want to. But the capital cost for that is pretty high. For solars, we do have some pretty complicated land use laws here, and this is a way of navigating some of that morass. They have that reduced maintenance of the solar panels and the reduced maintenance of the ground. And this is the big one for them, prime locations. There's a lot of land out there. Australia has a lot of land, but not all of it is close to power lines or close to a market where electricity or crops can be sold. And there is often substantial overlap between prime agricultural land and most desirable solar land.
Chad, you've only got 1 more minute. Just to
I'm at the end.
Oh, good.
So places where there's conflicts, you've got to use smaller equipment to get in and around the panels. And there's just a general pain in the ass charge of having to pay more attention about making your passes and turns. From the solar here in the US, we're a litigious society. Everyone likes to sue people. So there has to be liability protections for everybody in the terms of contracts. And that's possible. I just negotiated through one of those with an insurance and a solar place. And it was actually less terrible than you would think that negotiation would be. So there's a whole bunch of open questions. What's the best way to do all of this? But it's super promising. And I'm going to keep doing this work. And actually, we're building a full-scale demonstration here in Oregon. We've got the solar array financed. We're building it in the spring. I've got the electric tractor on the way. I have to buy the science equipment and put up a little pole building. And then we're just going for it. So we're going to continue to do this work, and love to keep in contact with anybody here.
Thank you so much, Chad. That was really interesting, particularly that you'd only need 1% of ag land. I think to to achieve the energy demand at the moment that we have. That's, yeah, it's eye-opening really when you hear about the conflict, the land use conflict debate. And I'd also love to continue to hear about your project that you've just outlined as well. So really appreciate your time, and we'll go to Paul because I know he has to jump off it after he speaks. And if there's any questions for Chad, just put them in the Q&A. And Chad, I think you're staying on. Hopefully we can get to those at the end. But thank you very much for that. Really interesting stuff. Like, I love agrivoltaics. I think it's fantastic. So if you just stop sharing now, and then I'll introduce Paul. So Paul Squires is a farmer, a winemaker and innovator near Yarrawonga in Victoria. He'll be speaking at our National Renewables Agriculture Conference next year in May, which I'm really happy about. But I've asked him to speak today because he's doing some interesting things around potentially planting potatoes under his 250 kilowatt solar array. I believe he's about to open his cellar door as well at the winery. So please, hopefully he does a bit of a plug for that, but please make sure you make an effort to get down there. Thank you so much. Paul, over to you. And if you just unmute yourself as well.
Thanks very much, Karen. Great presentation. Thanks, Chad. Really, thanks to Karen for putting me on straight after an associate professor. That's just fantastic. I feel really good now. I'm just going to share my screen. It's important to know I'm not an associate professor. So
farming would be just as hard, Paul.
No doubt, no doubt. Okay, a little bit first of all about who we are. So my wife and I run a very small 105-acre farm here in Esmond. If you haven't heard of Esmond before, that's okay. We only have a population of 6 people. There's us, the 2 people have just moved in over the road, and two about 1.5 kilometres away. We are in fact just about 15 kilometres east of Yarrawonga on the border of New South Wales and Victoria, here in northeast Victoria. And we've owned the property for about 20 years, but only started really farming it ourselves in the last 2 years. Having been the first 10 years of ownership, we were in England, and then moved back here to Australia, and then started farming and building the house a little while ago. So we have three main avenues here on the farm. We have grapes. We have about 22 acres of grapes. We have Shiraz and Jarif and Cabernet. So they're out there being irrigated at the moment by our solar array. The olives, similarly, we irrigate as well. And the broadacre farming, we share farm with a local farmer, and we normally have canola or wheat, only very small amounts compared to many of the people who are listening in today. So, however, for the moment, one of the most profitable areas for me in terms of farming is farming the sun. I entered into an arrangement a couple of years ago on a demonstration site, and the outcome has been that we have this bifacial, multi-dimensional solar system, and so we're now farming the sun, and we're looking to do more sort of vertical integration of what we do. So at the moment, out there next to me, if you're hearing, I'm hoping you're hearing hammers banging at some stage, and I'm hoping you're hearing paint being spread out. Our cellar door is being put together, and is hopefully open by Christmas if I go out and crack a few whips this afternoon. So it's important to know who we are not, though, especially if you're listening in thinking you're hearing about experts. You've already had the expert on. Chad has done obviously some amazing things. I've learned already quite a substantial amount this morning, particularly in regard to the need for me to get an army of graduates. I think that's what I'm going to need the most. But so I'm looking forward to contacting my local TAFE and seeing if I can get an army of graduates to do a whole lot of work for me. But I'm certainly no expert in energy. I'm absolutely not an expert in farming. In fact, I'm learning something new every day. There's some fantastic people I know listening in who are very, very good experts in sustainability and climate change. And once again, that's not me. So I'm pretty much not an expert in anything much. So I'm just probably here to talk about some of the things we've been doing and give you a very brief overview. In terms of the winery setting, we tried to set a closed loop agricultural setting for ourselves. So we put in place something we hope over the next 10 years we can really introduce, and the objectives are there. We're looking for improved marketability of our product, and some of that is at the core of all of this. Whilst the issues around climate change and sustainability are really, really strong and at the forefront, marketing your product that you're producing as a sustainable product is actually almost now more important. It's driving the market, and it's driving the economics, and it is driving your yield and your price. So we're also looking for continuous improvement in our wine and the offer that we have, and we're looking for continuous improvement in our profitability within a sustainable setting. I'd also like to thank Karen, of course, for giving me the opportunity for sharing experiences, but more importantly, for hearing from other people about their experiences. So, and we're looking to establish some level of best practice. So what that means in terms of our own vineyard management areas, and I won't go into the olives, etc., but water use is critical. In Australia, of course, we all know how important water is. I have an 80 megalitre water licence. I use about 35 megalitres on my crops. So I have about 50 that I can either sell, or as a result of hearing Chad, I might actually see if I can turn it into fertiliser. So we'll see how the economics of those sorts of things work out. We're all about soil improvement. We're doing some carbon capture. We're minimising our chemical use, trying to decrease our chemical use by 50% over the next 2 years. So it gets easier when you have dry years, especially in areas like this where you don't have to spray if you have dry years, and of course CO2 emissions as well. So in our production components, we have energy, which of course is critical, and up until the last 2 years have been paying what you're all probably paying, somewhere between 29 and 36 cents in just standard rate per kilowatt hour, and anything up to 86 and 90 cents in peak times, and then there's off-peak times as well. Water, currently water down here is back down to about $150 a megalitre, but you all know that it went as high as $1,000 a megalitre. So getting the most out of it, if you're selling it or buying it, is absolutely critical. Our packaging, how far our transport goes, we're trying to maximise our solid ore, because you don't have to transport, you get full retail price, etc. And then, as I said, chemical use. So this is our solar array. You might see more of it because it's used in quite a few pictures. I was able to take this photo of it surrounded by canola earlier in the year. In fact, it was a little early in the canola season, so the canola got really big this year. We had a fantastic year for canola, but surrounded by canola, and so that this is part of our tackling the energy of our previous components that I talked about. So the question really becomes, why do I bother doing this, for example? So the first critical reason is not because I'm some sort of climate change warrior or guru or anything like that. I'm very supportive of all of those things, but at the end of the day, my first criteria, as is of many farmers and many people, is around the economics of it. And it makes a whole lot of economic sense for me. Chad spoke of being able to sell power and produce power. We're able to do both here. We produce that power and then we sell it back in the excess that I don't use at the moment. We sell back into the grid for 12 cents a kilowatt hour. The second reason that we needed to do it was for security of supply. I don't know how everybody else exists, but we often have a lot of brownouts and in fact blackouts, and that impacts on our business quite significantly. I mean, it's just plain out annoying when you're at home and things shut down, but when you have things like that, we're going to have like large fridges and large freezers and cool rooms and those sorts of things, when your power shuts down, then you have a lot of loss. I spoke briefly about marketing. All of our products have a marketing capacity. So we're looking at being able to market, for example, that our wine is made from power from the sun. Our olives are powered by the sun. So everything that we have is powered by the sun. And then, of course, we have the environmental factor. You know, we are committed both in Australia and at a local level, and certainly here on our farm. My wife is really strongly into waste management. She works for a waste management firm. I have to separate every last bit of waste I have, and it goes into 8 different bins. And quite frankly, if I put in the wrong bin, there is a world of pain. So we are very committed to the environment as well, in a whole lot of practical ways. So this was another practical way to go about it. It does enable me to annoy my children, because I'm of a generation whereby my children blame me for all the ills of the world. I'm entering, well, I've entered my 50s. I have 2 adult children who are 25 and 21. And being university educated, they have found out that it is definitely my generation that has destroyed the world. So this really enables me to let them know that in a practical way that I'm well ahead of them. I produce all my own energy. We live in a 6-star rated house, and we're now producing quite a lot of our own vegetables, etc. So my children get really annoyed when they start talking about sustainability, and I start to indicate that it's all their fault with their laptops and their computers and their phones and their excess energy use. So Christmas becomes much easier. Technical stuff. I think I said our system's 250 kilowatts. It's actually 100 kilowatts. It's quite large, but it's 100 kilowatts. Up the top, you see this is a snap from my computer system. It's all online. I can go to it any time. Half the time, I don't really know what I'm reading because it's all very technical energy stuff. But generally, there's one there in the middle at 10:30 yesterday. 10:30 last Tuesday. At that instant, we were producing 87.5 kilowatts of power at that moment. And then down the bottom, you'll see that we've got the total kilowatts produced for the whole year. And over here on the right-hand side, this data here reflects the efficiency rate of various types. As I said, our system is bifacial, which means that the solar panels are both underneath and on top. So what happens is that because it is a system that is easting and westing, so it follows the sun right across, the sun reflects off the panels in front and behind and reflects back up onto the panels underneath as it moves. So it becomes about 96% efficient. And there's a couple of examples there of so single fixed and then just flat panels. So ours follows the sun all the way across and all the way around. I won't bore you with too much technical stuff because my person bores me enough with it already. So here you can see our system, and that's probably at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As it moves, not really huge, but as I said, very, very efficient. It's Australian made. It's Australian owned by companies here based in Wodonga. It's the Zero-Sol dual axis solar tracking system. We here on my farm, we were the alpha site. The beta site. It's an alpha male. It's a beta site here. So we were the first to have these bifacial solar panels, which were developed in Germany. It's a 100 kilowatt system. It was the first system introduced by Zero-Sol in Australia. And you can contact the organisers, Karen and whoever else, or myself, if you want more information. There are obviously lots of suppliers out there doing lots of different things, including the sponsors from today. So do your homework and have a look around if you're interested, but by all means contact various people. So as you can see, these are mounted on poles, and you can walk under them, and as I said, they move. They almost get to, at about 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, they almost get to being virtually vertical. So it is quite an extensive tracking system. And I must admit, I probably didn't realise the extent of that, the movement in them, in that when they were first put up and they were horizontal and flat, or the panels were horizontal and flat, it looked like there was quite a lot of height under them. And then all of a sudden, when they started to move, the level of height was very different. So of course, this brings us to some of the things that we've been talking about and Chad identified. But this solar versus farmland debate, Yarrawonga in this whole northeast area, Yarrawonga prides itself on having more sunshine than Queensland. It's one of its catchphrases for its own tourism and marketing purposes. I'm not entirely sure how true it is, so don't quote me, but there's obviously a lot of sunshine up here. So it makes for a really great area to be able to do those sorts of things. And as such, we do have quite a lot of solar farms here, and that creates a lot of debate. And at the moment, there's a lot of debate around solar farms taking up agricultural land, but they just can't be mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. And we're trying to prove that through this process. So at Winton at the moment, there's a massive solar farm happening, but and so there's issues around that. However, we think that there's an opportunity to grow under the solar system, grow crops and various other things, as Chad has pointed out. I think the sun can be very, very profitable. And to give you some idea, our solar farm takes up about 1,000 square metres, so only about a quarter of an acre. It produces about 250,000 kilowatt hours per annum. And at a rate of 9 cents a kilowatt hour, that gives you about $22,500 of generated power for 1,000 square metres. Now that's much better than wine, sheep, beef, canola, and olives all combined. So that's quite amazing on its own. So this is a revenue opportunity. I did a quick sum, and this is certainly these numbers are not warranted or guaranteed, but based on that, if I did 100 acres of the solar farm, and I have sought the capacity to do 6 more of these on my property, but I'm facing some difficulties. But if I did my whole 100 acres that I have here, that'd generate about $9 million per annum. So on an investment, I think of about 48 million, but that is very much, you know, back of the fag packet type of stuff, as we say here in Australia. But we are learning some lessons. We did plant some potatoes underneath just to have a look, and our system of reviewing that is nowhere near as intensive or has the capacity of Chad's, but we learned some lessons. Height. It probably needs to be a bit higher for us to get our machinery underneath, especially as it's tracking. We have infrastructure limitations both on our site and in terms of the transmission lines. There's so many things I don't know how to do. And one of those, of course, was actually planting potatoes. We hadn't done that much except in a little box before. So planting them on a wider scale was quite difficult. Getting companies organised around billing systems and how your billing systems work, as opposed to just being able to connect into the grid, selling back, etc. There is no right time to do this. New technology comes out every day that promises new things. You know, Tesla batteries in 12 months will be double the size they are now. Don't invest yet. Don't do this yet. More solar panels will do more next. There's no right time, but you have to start somewhere, like everything. We're not so great at monitoring the outcomes yet. I can't compare how many potatoes I've got per square metre as opposed to what I would do outside, but I know they were quite good when we first had them. So, and there is lots of capacity for growth. So as I learn more from things that other people are doing.
And also, Paul, you've only got you're pretty much out of time, and I know you've got another meeting to go to. So
yeah. So what we're looking at now is also, in addition to potatoes, I'm having some discussion with some pomegranate people. Our sheep are nowhere near as cute as Chad's, but we're looking at what we do with potentially with sheep under there, with a friend of mine who's got 800 sheep up the road. We're not doing cows, important to know. Cows won't work under this, we believe, because they tend to rub up and hit the system and cause damage. So cows are unfortunately out for us at the moment. Where to from here? In terms of our own farming, we're testing those multiple uses that I spoke about. I am looking at installing a public car charger just for my own use, but also for public use for people who come in to visit our cellar door. I've been in China quite a lot over the last few years, until recently, of course, and the take-up of electric vehicles over there in the 2 years I was there was just extraordinary. And that is coming here, no doubt, whether we like it or not, because that's what the car companies are going to be producing. I need to figure out how improve analysis of our use. We will be installing a battery. The whole thing does become part of an enterprise about our farm tour and how we tour the farm and what we do. And of course, to finish off, I need to continue to remind my children that I'm saving the planet and not them. So, as I said, welcome to take questions. There's some pictures down there. They're live pictures. That is the new Tesla truck that's available. Chad, thank you for your Selectron tractor. I'm really keen to have a look at that, and maybe we can find somebody in Australia who's an agent.
No, you have a company in Australia, RIPPA, R-I-P-P-A.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a Tesla tractor and a Tesla truck that are coming out within the next 2 years. So it is arriving, and farmers can benefit from being able to charge these up by using less than 1% of their land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was really interesting and very inspiring as well. I love hearing about farmers doing such progressive things in all areas. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
So I'd like you just maybe stop sharing your screen, and James Stacey is speaking next. If you come off mute, I'd like to now introduce James Stacey, who I first came across through Twitter. He's got a very healthy following. He's a Nuffield scholar, an irrigator, and he lives an hour from Adelaide in South Australia. I know he grows lucerne, oaten, hay, and grains. And he's also previously a dairy farmer, so really extensive experience in agriculture, which is great. And he's kindly agreed to speak to us today, even in the middle of harvest. So thank you so much, James, and over to you.
G'day, Karen. Thanks for having me on the session today. Yeah, we're at Langhorne Creek, which is about 60 km southeast of Adelaide, so near Lake Alexandrina. We've got 210 hectares, 90 hectares of centre pivot irrigation. So we have fairly extensive power bills. The main water supply, we do have River Murray water, but underground water is our main supply. So that's where most of the water's pumped from, and from a river. So a couple of years ago, like, we'd been looking at solar and what sort of was happening, and sort of solar feed-in tariffs for industrial sort of use had dropped to zero, and then it went up to 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and then it went back up to 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And our neighbours, who still dairy farm, had put a system on their dairy, a 25 kilowatt system. And I sat down with the guys that installed that, solar wholesalers in the Adelaide Hills, and I went through some rough numbers, because like we were spending $5,000 or $6,000 a month on power over the summer, and I thought we need to take a bit of the edge off that. So we're only small in the scheme of things with a 25 kilowatt system at this point in time, but we are connected to the grid still as well. So we do have that advantage of not having to generate diesel power to make power happen. So we're connected to the grid. So I'll basically just run through the numbers for us and how it's worked. We installed the system in 2018 in May, just before I left the country on my Nuffield, and we had a drought at home, so that was good. But yeah, the system's, it's got 30 kilowatts of panels, 25 kilowatt inverter, because that's what you can connect into the system in South Australia without, you can have 10 kilowatts of phase, I think, at the moment, and that's what you can hook up. So the cost for that system, the solar system itself, was about 24,000. And the ground mounting system, which if you've got a shed you don't have to pay for, was $12,000. And we decided there's two panel arrays, one's facing directly north and one's facing northwest, to extend the power delivery through the day. So that was done to try and generate more power that we could use. So we're pumping, we've got about 32 kilowatts of pumping capacity. So at the moment we're underdone in solar, but I'll explain what we will be doing in the future down the track. So at the moment, like through winter, we generate about 300 kilowatts a month. So, and at the feed-in tariff was 15 cents, but now it's been dropped to 14 cents. So that can generate us between $350 and $400 a month over the winter time. And then in summer, we generate between about 3,600 and 3,800 kilowatts a month. So on our power pricing that we are paying at the moment, our peak power price is 35 cents a kilowatt hour, and the off-peak's 22 cents a kilowatt hour. So the whole idea that I sort of see the advantage in solar connected to the grid is that if you can use your energy, like you don't let it go into the grid, you use it before it goes in the grid. Grid is the huge advantage you get from it. So for, say, in a summer month, if we use 3,000 kilowatts of power before the grid, and on average, that price, if we were buying the power from the grid, would be about 30 cents a kilowatt. So we're about $1,000 a month in front by using the solar system. So the savings we generate over the summertime and the credits we generate in the winter, the rough payback time is about 2 years for the actual solar system, and then another year for the ground mounting system. So I think it sort of stacks up to me as something that, like it was a pretty easy thing to do. We can save some money or get a system that is paying for itself within 3 years, which I think is pretty outstanding. So that's why we've done it. It has changed how we irrigate. Previously, we irrigated purely on off-peak power, so that was over the weekend and at night. So now we do irrigate more during the day, which you could argue is there's some efficiency issues there with more evaporation from irrigation, but that's just how we're sort of rolling with it. The issue now is in South Australia, that like at the moment, like that system, I can put the 25 kilowatts back into the system over the winter time, and that's all good. But in South Australia, SA Power Networks have restricted that down to 15 kilowatts of power going back into the grid from any system now. But in doing that, they've also allowed you to increase the size of your system. So you can potentially have a 40 kilowatt system, and yes, it's restricted to 15 back into the grid, but if you're using all that power, that's in your favor. So the plan here is I did build some capacity in the original system. I got them to put in bigger cable and conduit so they could connect more panels to the system we've got. But at this stage, we'll leave that because of the feed-in tariffs and volume we can put in. But we are building near the irrigation infrastructure, we're building another hay shed, and I'll probably be putting a 40 kilowatt system on top of that. And then that will feed to the same irrigation pumps to try and reduce our cost even further. That is sort of, I think that sort of system, like this, the original system will almost have paid for itself, and we'll go with the second system. There is a maximum allowance of 100 kilowatts of power generation per title here in South Australia before you're considered an industrial power generator. So between the new hay shed and existing sheds near our house, we will reach that 100 kilowatt capacity, and that's something that I want to do. Like I grow lucerne hay mainly for to feed people's big pets, their horses. So I'm not angling to promote my product as more sustainable or anything like that. I've purely done the solar installation as a cost saving measure, and yes, it does have the benefit of being better for everything, which is great, but it is about cost, and it is clear that you can get your money back quite quickly in a solar installation. And they say the panels are guaranteed for the 10 years, and then they potentially can degrade 5% a year over time. So it'll be interesting to see how long it does actually maintain that power. But I think the critical thing here is you need to use your power before the grid. You don't let your solar get into the grid when you need it, because that's when you get the biggest advantage from it. Like the power cost has come back in the last couple of years. We were up to 38 cents a kilowatt hour for peak power, and like with South Australia's push for renewables through solar and wind, power has come down. But power, in the past, they would show you the split between network charge and the power cost. And in South, we were pushing half of our cost was network charge. So by putting the solar in before the grid, you're eliminating that network charge on the power you're using. So that's where you get the big advantage from. I don't have any slides to show people, so you just have to listen to what I'm talking about. I think there's discussions from chat about electric tractors, which I think will have a big place in horticulture and in much of agriculture. But I think the reality is, for large broadacre Australian farms running big tractors and trucks, that the machinery sheds in the future will have a solar panel array on top and a hydrogen generator converter next to the shed, and that'll be filling tanks up, so you can use more energy when that's required. So yeah, and having the opportunity to do a Nuffield scholarship, you get to see, like I've been to Chad's country. I've driven from Boise in Idaho over the hills to Portland in Oregon and down to the coast, and yeah, it's a brilliant place, and there's plenty of desert and plenty of sunshine out there that you can generate power, and that's where Australia is hugely at an advantage, because we have so much land available. Like my panels are just, they've got some trees behind them and it's just grass underneath, and I don't do anything with it because it's only a small setup. So that's how that works for us. Yeah, so having the opportunity to go to places like the Netherlands and see electric cars everywhere and the wind turbines and solar, and it's funny, I went and saw a friend in France, and he had the same size solar system, and I was explaining recently how much I can generate over the winter time, and he can't believe it when his solar panels are covered in snow and generating nothing. So the advantage Australia's got is that, yeah, even like through winter you can generate good amounts of power through solar systems, so it's pretty good. And like, as people have seen, the power generation in South Australia, the solar and wind can often be 100% of the power that's generated for 2 million people. So yeah, and obviously technology changes, batteries and things like that will be great. Like our next car, we're hoping to buy a Tesla, and that'll be charged from solar energy at home. So, and I think that's where farmers we've got the space to generate the power, so you may as well do it. So that's my talk. A few questions did pop up, but
yep, thank you so much, James. That's really interesting. Particularly, you know, a payback of 2 to 3 years is really strong for a solar irrigation setup. Ours is 5 years, so it's just getting better and better with the prices. We'll have speakers on green hydrogen and ag, as well as electric utes at the national conference in May in Dubbo as well. So make sure you come along to that. So one of the questions that's come through is, have you considered DC coupled solar through VSDs for your hay irrigation? Then you potentially don't have the 100 kilowatt limitation on grid connection.
Yeah, I have looked at it. I looked at that before I actually did the solar install, and I don't fully understand it, so I can't completely comment on it. But the whole idea of being grid connected still is that I've got that flexibility, and I don't have to have any backup power generation. So the DC option is a good option if you don't have that grid connection. And I still, because I'm limited in the volume I can pump purely because of the capacity of the bores, I have to irrigate basically 24/7 over the summer. So if I had more capacity to extract water faster, or then you could look at just pumping during the day when you can generate the power.
Well, I might bring in Glenn Miller now. Glenn, if you take yourself off mute. So Glenn works for Reaqua. I do bits of work for Reaqua now and again. He's got 40 years experience in pumping experience, and he's a really great bloke as well. I don't know if you have a comment on that last question about the DC coupled solar or VSDs.
No, not really. It's you know, what was stated, what James said was you know, pretty much accepted across the board. You look at your grid connect, and that's where people, you know, are able to pump that 24/7. So they're utilising their solar to their best advantage. It's where situations like yourself, where you had no grid and you are completely reliant on solar or diesel to do your pumping. So, yeah, we see a lot of applications where, you know, they are using the grid to supplement. So, you know, that's the biggest thing that we get people is do an audit on their pumping systems to make sure they're actually using the pumps in the most efficient manner, whether it be using variable speed drives, the right size motors, etc. So that's probably the biggest downfall that we see is people with older infrastructure and technologies change through the years. So motors are more efficient, pumps are more efficient. But you know, my granddad did it this way, and I'm going to keep doing it that way because it worked for him. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the other question, there's something about electric vehicles, but I'm not sure if you'd be able to answer that, James. But the other question I think that came through around solar pumps was, what are the other most important elements that you might need to consider, I suppose, if a farmer wants to use solar irrigation? And you mentioned the export limits as well. I know that exists in our region.
Yep.
If we had been grid connected.
I think you just need to sit down and do your sums on what's going to work for you, and if like the previous guy said, if there's an opportunity to change your pumping system so it's more efficient, or you should do that as well. But yeah, it's just a matter of working out what's going to be best for your situation, and be realistic in how much water you're probably going to have to pump in peak times, because that's going to be when your highest use of bought-in electricity will be.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, James. That's really helpful information, and great to see what you're doing on your property with Renewables. So really appreciate your time.
Yep.
So next, I'd like to introduce Dominic Murphy. So he's from Meredith Dairy, and I can say, speaking from experience, this is like a vegan's Achilles heel. So Dominic has a farming background, and he started his career as a diesel mechanic before becoming a mechanical engineer and turning towards sustainability, energy, waste and machinery design products. So he works at Meredith Dairy as their environment sustainability officer and works as well on his family's farm. So thank you, Dominic. I'll just keep reading this.
Thank you. You can hear me and see the screen okay?
Yep, all good.
Okay. So, Meredith Dairy, just to introduce the dairy, it's a family-owned business started by the Camerons. In 1991, they shifted over to dairy products. Previously, they were predominantly a wool farming property. It now covers 1,800 hectares with multiple farms on that property. So all of the farms are run sort of as their own businesses. The dairies provide milk to a central factory where that's all processed into predominantly goat dairy products, but there's also one remaining sheep dairy, which is where they started off. And there's also a cropping operation. So probably most of the vast majority of the property is covered in is crop and pasture, with about 16% set aside to biodiversity protection, tree plantation, things like that. And there's a focus on renewable energy, sustainability in agriculture, climate change mitigation across the business. So not just energy, but that's really all I'll talk about today. Recycling, biodiversity protection. And I also, it's not just me, I have a counterpart, my colleague Tim Johnson, who sort of focuses on the farm side of the business. And the Meredith Dairy vision is to produce food sustainably. So I'll start with energy. So to give you an idea of the factory operation, at our factory, we use sort of energy in two main, I guess, fields. One is electricity, which is for refrigeration, pumps, and the processing equipment for the factory, and heat. So we use a lot of hot water over two main circuits. One is a circuit that we call the ring main, which is a high temperature circuit, and we need that to run our pasteurizers, our incubator for yogurt, and a general heat supply to the factory for different operations. And we also have a lower temperature circuit, which we call a domestic hot water, which is about 60 degrees, and we use that for wash down. So every time we change a batch of milk or cheese or anything like that, it has to be washed down. So we use a lot of water and a lot of heat and a lot of electricity, and it's pretty much continuous. At our other sites, we have, which are dairies, we use pumps, dairy milking equipment, hot water, refrigeration. So that's probably more a realistic, not a realistic, a more common load that potentially some of the people on here will be used to, dairy loads. A lot of the time not ideally suited to solar because they use a lot of power early in the morning and sort of in the afternoon, and not much through the day. So with the factory, about 5 years ago, we installed a wood-fired boiler. Now, wood is a biomass source, so the boiler is a bioenergy installation. Bioenergy is, I guess, gaining a fair bit of momentum in Australia, and it's, I guess, particularly in wood chips and things like that, and anaerobic digestion, it's probably more progressed overseas and in Europe. And what that boiler does, it runs continuously. It never stops, but it does ramp up its output, so the rate at which wood chips are fed in. It was manufactured in Poland and supplied by a local Australian company, and we feed it with wood chips. So we feed it with wood chips from a recycled source, so old timber frames and pallets and things like that. We used to plant trees on site and chip those periodically, but we don't do that anymore because we don't do it as often because we just like to leave those trees where they are, and it's much more cost effective to be able to get recycled chips which have already been used for a building or pallets, and they would otherwise just be sort of used as mulch in gardens, and we use them in the wood-fired boiler. And we go through about 1 to 1.3 tonnes of wood chips per day for the boiler. And we still have LPG boilers on site as a top up throughout the day. So if we're using more than the wood-fired boiler or the storage tank can supply, or if we have machine maintenance or downtime, we have them as backup as well. For the domestic hot water, so for the water we use about 15 to 25,000 litres a day at 60 degrees, so quite a bit of energy. And we've tried to sort of reduce that demand by solar evacuated tubes, which are the solar tubes on your roof. And what they do is preheat the storage, and then we extract heat from the higher temperature circuit to bring that up as it's used. So one issue that we have, because we're always operating, the factory operates in the early hours of the morning, as do the dairies, is that we outstrip our storage before the sun comes up. So in this instance, we're not talking about electrical energy, we're talking about thermal energy stored in water, but still we don't have enough storage at the moment to use that. So we're not really maximising the solar evacuated tubes at the moment, which means that we put a greater demand on the ring main, which means potentially we might have to bring in LPG, which is something that we really want to get away from. So the opportunities for us at our site are to increase efficiency, minimise our losses. Obviously, that's the number one thing we should be aiming for, and increase storage. So because we're talking about heat, we don't need a battery that uses sort of rare materials. We can store that energy in water. It's an extremely environmentally friendly battery, so that's a really good way to do it. Increase our heat reclaim because we have refrigeration, we have waste heat, and our thermal capacity, so install more generators. So to give you an idea, this is a day, probably a month or two ago that I picked. And this is the energy supply and the heat supply and demand to our factory for that day over a 24-hour period. So wood chips are extremely cheap, but unfortunately for the people who like bioenergy in the room, gas is also very cheap when you use a lot of it. So it detracts from the business case. But even with all those things considered and the inefficiencies, I guess, of a wood-fired boiler, we can get a gigajoule of energy into our water for $7.60 from wood chips. And that same energy into that water costs us $23 from LPG. So it's significant. So ideally, we'd like to run entirely off wood chips, and we'll be there in the very near future because we're installing more storage capacity. So those wood chips supply 70% of our energy demand, and that 70% costs us $25,000 a year. I see hand raised. I might just keep going with this, and I'll answer that in a second. Yeah, that 70% of energy costs us $25,000 a year. If we can entirely shift that, our entire heat demand from the site will be met for $36,000 a year. The remaining 30% of energy actually costs us more than the vast majority that we get from wood chips. And if we didn't have a wood-fired boiler at all, the LPG costs for heat on the site would be nearly $110,000. So we're already saving a significant amount with a lot more to save, and we're offsetting fossil fuel use. Bioenergy is essentially a big battery. You're drawing down carbon from the atmosphere in the growth of those trees in that biomass, whether it be timber in our circumstance or other biomass sources going into technologies like anaerobic digestion. So we're sequestering that carbon and then releasing as it's burnt. So I guess the onus is on us and our suppliers to make sure that we're sourcing our feedstocks in sustainable ways. Can I just ask, I see a hand raised? Will I answer that? I can't actually see what the question is, or
yeah, I can't either. So maybe just keep going.
Okay.
Let's get you Q&A.
Yeah, I can answer at the end. So I guess going back to solar, we've already installed solar at all of our sites. We've done all the things that big energy users generally do: efficient equipment, solar, all sorts of things. But some of you may be familiar with this. This is interval data from our network distributor. So this is, you can see sort of in the middle here is probably quite a common curve, which is a result of solar being on site. So we use power from the grid overnight. We start using it in the morning as things get turned on in the factory, and then we sort of cut into that through the day as solar comes on. So although we can add more solar and we plan to install some more solar, really we would need a huge amount of solar coupled with batteries to be able to meet our demand. And not only is there variation throughout the day, there's variation throughout the year. So every day we use heat and we use electricity, but the variability in solar irradiance and the amount of electricity that's generated from a given size solar system throughout the year is highly variable. So we really need to pick a point and say, if we were going to go entirely on solar, do we want a system that will be sort of ridiculously oversized in summer, or do we want something that is going to be too small in winter because of our particular load? So I guess we want a technology that matches our demand. And another thing is that we purchase large-scale generation certificates for our site because we want to be 100% renewable. So not only do we pay power bills, we pay for LGCs, which is a cost. So here are the options I spoke about: solar PV, battery storage, anaerobic digestion. We have a lot of livestock, obviously a lot of manure, and that is a bioenergy technology, or another option is a wood biomass combined heat and power system. So essentially what that is you run wood chips to make gas, and you run that gas in an engine, a gas engine, reciprocating gas engine, and you run a generator. So what that does is allows you to generate electricity, and also, as most all engines will do, you have that waste heat, and because we have a heat load on site, that will allow us to further offset our wood-fired boiler. So the two coupled are extremely well matched to our site. So we'll be pursuing with a combination. So just to return to that day that I gave as an example, that same day where I had our interval data, this is how much power we're using in that day in half-hour increments. If we install a 60 kilowatt electrical combined heat and power system, almost all of our grid demand overnight is gone, with some smaller remaining demand in the morning and afternoons. And if we also couple that with 20 kilowatts of solar PV, which is a very long way away from the size of system we'd need if we only went with solar, we can actually be a net exporter through the day with some demand in the morning and afternoon, or ideally we'll shift loads and we'll continue to sort of improve the efficiencies on the site to a point where we are a net, we are not a net draw on the grid, but potentially a net exporter from the grid, while saving us a lot of money and being a carbon neutral source. Quickly, our other sites, a large installation like this doesn't make a lot of sense when you're not using the sort of power that we use. So we're installing waste vegetable oil heaters on our site. The jar that was held up earlier with oil in there, we have a little bit of that, so we can heat that, and things like heat reclaim, staged heating, so extracting heat from milk and putting it into water, thermal storage, more solar, and load shifting. And just quickly, we're doing things in other parts of the operation. We're doing a lot of recycling. We now have 26 different recycling streams across different areas of the business, which has reduced our waste to landfill by about 80% in the last 6 months. We have a tree planting program, native grassland management, manure application and composting, and also, as I mentioned, my colleagues doing a lot of work around improving soil health and other aspects of the farming operation. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dom. That was really interesting, and what a sustainable business. Like, it's really impressive, and it makes me feel good when I buy Meredith Dairy. So thank you very much for that. So there's a question here, which you might have covered really, but have you considered using gasifier instead of a wood chip boiler?
The combined heat and power unit is so it's a gasifier, and it runs a gas engine. Oh, so yes, yep. And to give you an idea of relative costs, the sort of size we're talking about, we're looking at the moment at 3 different options, somewhere in the sort of $300,000 to $600,000 investment, and payback is 3 years, 4 years. So extremely good. Yeah. And like I said, the sort of carbon neutrality aspect around biomass, you know, solar really does have its place, and we will be installing more solar, but for a business like us that has huge heat and ongoing electricity demands right across the 24-hour period, combined heat and power is really probably going to be key for us.
Mm. I guess when I've spoken to a lot of farmers or even bioenergy businesses, they often say that the issue with bioenergy is that the waste streams that you use, I know you buy in your wood chips, but if they were to use the waste on their farm, and you mentioned you might be using the waste from your animals' manure, currently, you know, that's used in other ways that provides value, whether it's spread on paddocks and, you know, natural manure, so putting it, then burning it or whatever you do to create energy. Yeah. You know, there's a cost benefit analysis to that. Have you done that for your farm?
Yeah, so I guess there's two things. There's like if we were going to divert manure, towards that would be towards anaerobic digestion. So putting it in an enclosed vessel to generate a gas which is predominantly methane and carbon dioxide. You're burning the carbon hydrogen component of it, but you retain a high nutrient product called digestate at the end of it. So the hesitations personally that I have around that are more around the logistics of a biodigester for our actual operation rather than nutrient loss, because you still do have that digestate product. The biodigesters in our operation, I guess, have issues because we sort of have sheds and clear out periodically. You'll actually lose a lot of the potential to the potential energy to sort of volatilization rather than it being a high energy source. So that's not the concern. I think a concern potentially is that people don't feel uncomfortable about burning wood chips, but I think really it's about a sensible discussion that we're planting trees and it's a very environmentally friendly battery to store energy, and if you have that in replenished in a circular way, it's really a big part of the solution.
Yeah, I have to agree. Before I go on to some of the questions that came in at registration, do any of the speakers have any questions for each other before I head on to questions that came through registration? No? Okay, well, I might introduce Jeff Lodge now. So if you just turn your speaker and your mic on. So Jeff is our second expert with Glenn. He's got over 20 years experience in the Victorian Public Service, based in the Shepparton area, managing natural resource management on irrigation properties. He also owns and manages a 2-hectare native seed production area. And he's been CEO of GV Community Energy since about September 2010, in the inception. Has great knowledge I've learned in the ag and energy space. So it'd be good to get maybe your thoughts on any of those presentations. I know James Stacey mentioned a 10-year life for the solar panels, and I know that they're more like 25, and we've discussed before they can actually be 35 years. So you might want to comment on that. And then there's a question that was, what are the two biggest hurdles to increased market penetration of renewable energy and its optimization in agriculture?
Okay, thanks, Karen, and thanks for the speakers. It was fascinating. If I start on the issue of the projected life and performance of solar panels, I'll just clarify that as a rule, solar panels will lose about 1% production per year. So that means after 50 years of operation, they'll be running at 50% capacity. There's variability within the marketplace, but as a general rule, that can be applied. Typically, solar farm managers look at a functional life of around 30 years and would be projecting replacements in that time frame. Bearing in mind that the serviceable life can actually extend out to 50 and beyond, but recognising that's hypothetical because the technology isn't that old at the moment that's being used in the marketplace. Working in this space, I guess the key learning for me in terms of there is no absolute, and we need to be careful about making absolute statements and recognise that every site is different and needs to be customised. And with that is recognising that when we talk about economics, the electricity tariffs vary significantly across the states. So when I'm hearing people talking about what tariffs are on, particularly the variation from Yarrawonga across to South Australia, there is great variability within those regions as well. And one of the spaces that we operate in is reviewing electricity tariffs, and we know there are significant savings to be made in that space. Be mindful that over the last 40 years, the differential between off-peak and peak has changed remarkably. 40 odd years ago, peak power was about 500% dearer than off-peak. Today, it's typically 50% dearer. What that means is historically a lot of operations have geared for off-peak, whereas now the market and the business case is more compelling to shift to peak operation utilising solar or other renewable energy generation. So it's mindful to understand and customise the economics in that space. In terms of impediments and what is reducing the uptake of renewable energy in the farming sector, there were two key learnings and issues for consideration. And the first one is the advice and information and credibility of where that's sourced from. And what to me is critical is recognising that there is local knowledge and local expertise within every region, and the necessity of using those networks and knowing that there's reliability and accessibility of your investments being serviced. In Northern Victoria, I know many landowners get exposed to businesses out of metro areas, promised the world, delivered quick, and slow to come back. You pay a price for that. And supporting regional industries and businesses is consistent with being sustainable. So it's about getting good advice. The other impediment is a perception that investing in renewable energy takes a long time to pay back. And what we've heard with speakers today is quite incredible returns on investment of 2 to 3 years. There's also concern about how much is consumed and how much is exported. In many cases, you can have an investment in solar that will have 100% exported and your payback period is around 5 years. So over-capitalising in solar is commercially viable today. It wasn't 5 years ago, it is today. So I, for example, have a client, a dairy farm, and 70% of their solar is exported to the grid and their payback is less than 5 years. In time, they will shift their operation to take advantage of their electricity because it is cheaper to come from solar than it is to come from the grid. But when you do the economics, there's an opportunity cost because you can sell that electricity back to the grid. So it is a cheap battery. It is a cheap investment. And typically you're looking at around 10 to 12 cents. Be mindful that it's government regulated, so that tariff may not persist in time or it may be reduced. So they're the factors about if you want to be more self-reliant, consuming more reduces your exposure to the variations within the market space. So it's about having confidence in the market, the technology, and talking to peers, neighbours, and people in the sector is an important part of this whole conversation. And that's why I welcome these types of webinars, because it gives people some confidence to know that other people have done it. It does make economic sense, and the necessity that together we must all reduce our carbon footprint. And the farming sector is so exposed to climate change, and it's so imperative that they collectively look at cost-effective ways to reduce their carbon footprint.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Completely agree with everything you've said. I guess, but one thing that comes up for me is that we have export limits on our network because they can't take so much solar in. But we need grid modernisation to allow farmers to be able to get a good return on feeding back into the grid and more dispersed distributed energy resources, obviously, but that can sometimes be a bit of a barrier as well to feeding back into the grid. I just have a question for Chad that came up before, which is how, I don't know if you know this, but how, or some of the other speakers might know, how important is it for agricultural land to rest? How can solar farms assist while still managing the vegetation underneath without it becoming a fire hazard?
So as it regards to risk, we reached a decent compromise with liability. So it was kind of like, you insure your stuff, we'll insure ours, and that was how we partitioned the risk. With, you know, us essentially getting a payment for the sun up front, a solar company owning the solar equipment. Now, if you're have your own equipment, great, then you probably should insure it for weather issues and so on. Fire risk, that's going to depend on your climate. I mean, I know that there's vast parts of Australia that are really dry, really dry, and you know, the water savings is great and it helps keep things green in certain circumstances, but it won't bloom the desert, right? There has to be at least a little water there to make it viable.
So the question, could be my accent, was more about is it important to allow agricultural land to rest, as in not
to rest?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I mean, you have to crop rotate. Here in the US, we have some standard crop rotations for, well, the classic is corn and soy, and then for the potato rotation out west here with large commodity crops, it rotates with beets, hay, and corn. So that has to be incorporated into all good soil management practice, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's also another question earlier about the types of, and then Dom, I think you have something to say.
I just wanted to probably say that on the resting question, I think I sort of get the impression from the questioner asking it in relation to renewable energy. I would just say that resting and crop rotations, as Chad mentioned, are important, and that comes into land management. But I wouldn't suggest that we take land entirely out of service to rest it for decades. I think there's much better.
Yeah, I don't want to give the impression that we take any land out of production. In fact, the whole point is that you don't have to, and you can get 2 paychecks if you do it right, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. And that was the solar developer that asked that question, actually.
Yeah.
So just trying to understand the ag area. The other question, Chad, before that I saw in the chat box was about what types of crops you can grow under solar panels.
Yeah, so myself, colleagues have done trials on several vegetable crops, potatoes, beans, there's been a corn trial, peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, agave, and others. Generally, it's climate dependent. So in Arizona, the best was tomatoes, and that's a very desert environment. So tomatoes in Oregon, they actually did better, but it wasn't tons better. Here, the cold vegetables worked a lot better. So potatoes, lettuces, brassicas, root vegetables in general are the things that did really quite well in this situation. I haven't tried any perennials yet. That's what I want to do in the future. You know, certain berries, low-lying berry crops, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, I think are also good candidates.
Yeah, I've heard that raspberries and berries at that Agrivoltaics conference were presented on and seemed to do really well under solar panels. Those kind of crops. So there's another question that came through registration, which are there any studies into ideas for farmers to use their locally generated solar or wind electrical power in an unusual or novel way to further reduce the use of fossil fuels? So I'll open that up, and I've got ideas around that as well, but if there's anyone that would like. Yep, Dom?
I just think that there's a lot of renewable energy development in Victoria. There are renewable energy zones, and because we have such high generation in areas where there aren't people, we're then now hitting issues which has sort of huge social license issues around transmission infrastructure. So I think decentralisation is just huge. You know, use the power, bring industry back to the regions, and don't worry about transmission lines.
Yeah, so I'm working on a microgrids in agriculture project that was federally funded, which is looking at that really. How can agricultural communities or farmers that produce energy share and trade energy in geographical boundaries? So you don't necessarily have to put it into the main grid, but your neighbours can buy for a price that's lower than they would from the grid, and you can sell it for a price that's higher. And if there's export limits, the other ways around with using software to get around those types of limitations. Yes, Charlie?
Yeah, Karen, if I could just make a comment that term social license to operate is a bit like you're on mute. It's the term of 2020. And it's a really important issue though, especially in small regional communities, as I mentioned, and most particularly now with transmission lines that need to be built so we can roll out the renewable infrastructure that's needed to close down the fossil fuel generation. If that social licence to operate is just a tick a box exercise from developers and from governments and transmission line holders, it's not going to work. And we'll have the same inane arguments we had about wind turbines about 15 years ago, which was a consequence of really bad corporate behaviour from large multinational organisations and small fly-by-night developers that treated small regional communities, including farmers, with disdain. If that happens again, it'll be really unfortunate because we have an opportunity to reshape the whole energy system, but also to reshape in Australia, at least, Chad, I'm not sure how it is in the US, but we can reshape regional Australia into a really vibrant economic and social wonderland if we get it right. And it's up to us as regional communities to direct and manage that, because nobody else has a vested interest in doing that, preferably led by local government. That's just from me.
So to pick up on that, Charlie, we have similar problems here in the United States. One of the big resistances within local communities is the fact that there have been some large multinational companies come in and try to do a land grab without respect or deference to the culture or heritage of that space. And yeah, there has to be an issue. There has to be deference there to the agricultural and rural communities. And if it's not, it's going to be bad because, you push hard against something, it only pushes harder back.
So we have, in New South Wales, we have 3 renewable energy zones at the moment. One of them is where I live pretty much in the Central West, and I'm working with the government there to ensure that they do very strong community engagement and landholder engagement. They're working with Transgrid, which is the high voltage transmission that will be going in as well. And I know that they're working pretty hard to try and understand the issues and make sure that these solar and wind developments complement agriculture and are very careful around the use of prime agricultural land. But also in saying that, a farmer has a right to decide what they want on their land. If a farmer wants to put a solar development on there and not farm that land, that's up to them, because they can see that there's going to be huge money to be made from leasing that. But ideally, that, like Chad pointed out in his presentation, you do multiple purpose land use within the solar panels, whether it's pollinator environment, whether it's agricultural land, whether it's biodiversity corridors. I think that would be the ideal scenario for the renewable energy zones, but the government can't force the actual solar and wind developers to do that, but they can certainly try and influence.
Can I just make one more quick comment on that, Karen? Individuals and farmers have the right to have an open and fair and transparent negotiation, but there has to be some limit to the right of individuals to resist. If they have the opportunity for a fair and open and transparent negotiation, there has to be a limit to their right to oppose and even sometimes stymie developments, because if we allow people to stop this renewable energy generation, either through ideological or misinformed or ill-informed resistance, then it's not going to happen. And the vested interests that have dominated the energy generation in fossil fuel industries in this country particularly, but probably in the US as well, will continue to dominate. And that just can't be allowed to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to solve the climate crisis.
There's actually, in the New England area, so that's the second renewable energy zone in New South Wales, there's a group of farmers there that are being really proactive in the way that they manage these community benefits and shared benefits from large-scale solar. So there's one guy there, Paul, who has been able to gather 35 landholders around where he lives to form an executive council of 8 of them who then deal with these solar and wind developers. So as soon as a solar developer approaches one of these people, they say, go to our executive council, and they have a list of demands of what they want in terms of community enhancement funds, or what the lease might be for each turbine on a property, or the solar panels. So I think that's a really smart way of landholders and communities working in a way that's collaborative, rather than with this confidentiality agreements that sometimes happen with these large-scale solar and wind developers. It means farmers kind of almost like a fight to the bottom, a race to the bottom. So I think that's a really, really clever way of doing it. So there's just been a comment here from Liz saying there's actually a company in Gippsland, Alternative Energy Innovations, who have designed and are trialling a technology that will allow small power generators to export power to neighbouring properties, i.e. across site title boundaries, which is quite difficult at the moment. They have AusNet's permission to do this, which is a first, which is exciting. So there's all these new developments happening, I guess, around the modernisation of the grid and enabling farmers to do things a bit better, and communities to benefit from localised energy as well. So if there's no more, I've just noticed the time, if there's any more, no more comments or questions from our speakers or panellists, I'd like to just once again thank everybody for being part of today. I think it's really important to keep these discussions going, and I really appreciate the time and expertise of all of the speakers and FCA for helping this to happen, and Regen Energy as well for the sponsorship. So thank you again to everybody, and this will be recorded. This has been recorded and will be uploaded on the Farmers for Climate Action website. I believe Claire will probably do that in the next week or so. So if you missed any of it, you can catch up then. So have a good week and have a good Christmas, everyone, and good luck, James, with the rest of harvest. And thank you so much, Chad, as well, for zooming in from the US. Really appreciate that.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Karen. Great conference.